Welcome to the FITDRIVERS Podcast, sponsored by 10th Street, connecting carriers and drivers to make life easier, pre and post-hire. From efficient and seamless recruiting to tools that keep drivers engaged and compliant and on the road. 10th Street helps you market, hire, retain, and grow. Learn more at 10thstreet.com. Welcome, everybody. I have to tell you, I'm really excited about this segment here today because I've got a long-time friend that's going to join me, and you're going to get some real education here and hear from really a very knowledgeable person in the nutrition industry and health and wellness. I'm going to bring on Scott Forsberg. Scott is a microbiologist by education and a leader in the health and wellness industry with over 3 decades of consumer product innovation experience. In his career, Scott has overseen the development of more than 300 products and is named inventor on more than 10 patents. And currently, Scott is his latest venture. He's the CEO of Wellvine, which I'm going to ask him to get into and tell us about that in a little bit. But first of all, everybody, welcome Scott. Scott, good to see you, my friend.
Great seeing you too, Bob.
Right on. So I was trying to remember back when you and I first met. It seemed like it's, way back in the 90s, right? Is that
it is? Yeah, I think I was still at Nature's Way at the time.
That's right.
So that is 30 years ago. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
It is.
So all the new listeners out there, Scott has always been my go-to guy when it comes to nutrition, and he's always so generous, and he's so well known around the country, but he's always so generous when I call him with a question or email him, whatever, to get his opinion, information on something. And he's been just more than generous to me. I don't deserve his friendship sometimes. The things he's helped me with has been great. So Scott, to get started here, why don't you just take a few minutes and just tell my listeners why you're so passionate and how you got started in health and wellness nutrition and why you're so passionate about it.
Well, like you said, I studied microbiology in college, and I kind of had an eye on maybe going into medicine or, into pharmaceutical research or something like that. And as I started to explore that and look into what there was to offer there, it became apparent to me that where my real passion was in helping, not necessarily to try and intervene once a person was unhealthy, although I think that's obviously really, really important and necessary. But what I was interested in is more prevention, in keeping healthy people healthy and in extending what I refer to as health span versus, just lifespan. So a lot of the things that we do nowadays in medicine, they're designed to help people in a crisis, which is really, really important. But I like the idea of never getting to that crisis point in the first place. And that also, for me personally, kind of fit in better with, my own kind of philosophy, which is that you need to do everything you can to maintain not just good health, which leads to a strong body. But I think having a strong body and doing well with health leads to a strong mind and a strong personality and, frankly, just a greater quality of life. So it was really all about that quality of life part. And to me, the best way to accomplish that was by understanding, everything from nutrition to exercise to kind of natural medicine, natural approaches to maintaining better health and a better life.
Great. I hear you, and that's what I always remember most about you. Another something that I found very similar with you is, many years ago when he was really active and out there, but Dr. Andrew Wild, I went to a couple of his town hall sessions and would follow him and listen to him and always found it very interesting. He always loved to talk to people who were doing well, right? Just not somebody that wasn't, but he always was curious to find out, what do you do, right? What do you do to stay healthy, right? He always found it very interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn from people who have done that. When we look around and say, well, how do you understand what to do in order to keep people healthy and make sure that they live healthy, productive lives? The best thing you can do, of course, is to find people who've managed to accomplish that. And you're right, Andy Weil and others like him, the early 90s, Jeff Bland, that was a time when the industry was really starting to become kind of mainstream. You had the passage of the Dietary Supplement Act as well, which helped to kind of bring all this stuff to light and bring things into the mainstream. So that was a seminal period for the industry, and I think for the mindset of people who were targeting wellness rather than just, intervention in disease and in crisis.
Yeah. And I remember that's where I learned from him, listening to him and also talking with you about early on. And people, it was like when I would talk to them about, they said, what do you mean? And, about the corn syrup additives, right? All that high fructose corn syrup, all those things, right? That nobody even knew about that they were consuming, and how an adverse reaction that has on your system, especially in the population I deal with, drivers, right? That those type of things, when they're trying to manage their blood pressure and their sugar levels and so forth, those things can really be a negative, correct?
They can. It's hard to sort all that out, and it's hard to keep it all straight. There's so much information out there. Right. There's so many things that people say that you need to pay attention to and to do and whatnot. And it can be kind of overwhelming, to be honest with you. And I think that the whole idea of a healthy lifestyle doesn't come down to, figuring out all these little tiny things that you have to do, whether it's avoid high fructose corn syrup or try and get, more of this nutrient, less of that nutrient. Balancing all that becomes, I think, very, very difficult unless you're someone who's trained in it, or unless it's a serious hobby for you. It can be hard to sort all that out. So what I like are the common sense kinds of approaches that you hear from the strongest voices in the industry out there, which are people who basically say, look, you need to approach this from a common sense perspective. What can you do that makes sense, that is a good general guideline for things that will allow people to live good lives, but also not completely consume their time and their energy and put them in a position where, all they do is study nutrition or study these other things and then try and tweak and implement it all the time. I think it can be, it can take you down a rabbit hole where you end up consuming your time, your money, your effort for very little marginal gain,
It can be very overwhelming, and that's a great segue into what I wanted to ask you about. You know about professional drivers. I know your wife, wellness expert, and she worked with some trucking firms as well and understands that population. And so tell us, for drivers, and this is something I have many, many conversations with, they get so confused, right? You just said so much information out there. Take this and how do you get so consumed with all the information out there, and you get a lot of people, they get confused. And not only that, is they say, this is just too much, right. And they don't do anything. So how do you help someone like drivers that are just really trying to make small little changes that can make a difference to help them? Because the number 3 listings out there that when I work with drivers, they lose their ability to drive is number 1, their blood pressure. Number 2 is high glucose sugar levels. And then 3, sleep deprivation. So how do you talk to drivers out there and give them easy steps on how to make it simple and not to get overwhelmed?
Yeah. So the thing that I think you need to do is you need to make sure that you make the changes first that will make the biggest difference with the least amount of effort, right? Okay. So you start with the interventions that make the biggest difference and can be done, relatively easily, instead of trying to do everything all at once. So right. you grab that, first best option and you go after it, and you're already an advocate for that. And Bob, you know way more about that than I do. And that is that it's movement, it's exercise to some extent. If you can move, you can exercise, you can do other things. It's amazing how much that helps in all kinds of ways. Even with nutrition, if you have the world's best diet, but you don't move, then you won't have muscle tone. You won't have, in fact, movement affects digestion. So the ability to absorb nutrients and use them properly, all of that is really dependent on some level of movement. So that's really the first place to start. And it doesn't have to be extensive.
Right.
One of the things that I've noticed, and you've probably seen this too over the last year or so, there have been a couple of studies out there which are really interesting that have shown that you don't have to go into the gym and lift weights for an hour or so in order to get gains. You can do it in 15 or 20 minutes. Right. You can do one set, close to failure. You don't even have to go all the way to failure. So the 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps where you completely exhaust muscles, that will help you to gain size in your muscles a little bit. And it will help you if, your goal is to look a certain way or to significantly increase muscle mass. It's probably better to do that kind of exercise. But what these studies are showing now is that one rep done on 4 exercises for your upper body, which takes you about 15 minutes, will give you the strength and endurance that you need in order to maintain health. And you can do that 2 or 3 times a week and be just fine. And I think people have this misconception that if I'm going to start an exercise program, I'm going to have to do it, 5-6 days a week, and it's going to take an hour and a half. And that's just not the case. So I think understanding that you can have a big impact in the way you feel and in how your body responds with a relatively modest investment in time, as long as you're consistent with it, that's the message I would put out there first, is that you can do this without having to, commit a huge amount of time and effort to it, and start there. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, when it comes to nutrition, again, once you've got a foundation, you can do other things like try and avoid certain nutrients and watch what foods you eat and everything. But I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Pollan. He's written several really interesting books. In Defense of Food is one, The Omnivore's Dilemma. And most of them are about how food affects not just your body, but also your mind, and affects your mood and your behavior and your motivation and everything. Very interesting body of work he has out there. And he has some really simple advice, which I really like. I don't think I can improve on it. The one thing is, try to eat whole foods as much as possible. And by whole foods, we mean foods that haven't been significantly altered or deconstructed and then reconstructed. Right. So, for example, if you look at the list of foods now in a lot of prepared food, or ingredients in a lot of prepared foods, you're going to see all kinds of things in there which your grandparents wouldn't recognize as food. Right. They're not going to be in your pantry. They're not going to be in your fridge, right? This is stuff that you can't buy even in a grocery store necessarily as an ingredient, but you can buy it as a prepared food in a grocery store. But you couldn't make it at home because all this stuff is highly industrialized and highly processed. And so just try not to eat those things, as much as possible. Eat a piece of fruit, right? Eat a vegetable. Even, if you're going to eat bread, you can make bread with salt, water, and yeast. And flour. That's all you need, right? So just try and get stuff that's as close to being whole and as close to being a recognizable food as possible. So that's number one in his list. Eat whole foods. The second thing is harder to do because it takes a little bit of willpower. But his second piece of advice is not too much. So eat whole foods and not too much. Right. You probably know this, but I lived in Japan for 3 years.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah. And I lived there when I was, I started, I went over there the first time when I was 19 years old. And I was raised on a pretty standard kind of, American diet, right? Meat and potatoes, TV dinners. It's just the way it was when I was growing up.
Sure.
I went to Japan and it blew my mind. There was none of that stuff. There was all kinds of whole foods and fresh vegetables, all this stuff. And it completely changed the way I eat. But one of the really interesting things is they had a phrase there, which is it's hara hachibu in Japan. And what it means is you eat until your stomach is 80% full and then you stop. And the reason you do that is because it takes a little bit of time for your brain and for the hormones that govern appetite to catch up to where your stomach is. So if you eat till 100%, you're probably actually at 120 or 130% because there's that little bit of lag time between when you're actually full and when your brain and your biochemistry tells you you're full.
Right.
So you stop at 80%, and that means you're going to have the amount of food that you need. So when you think to yourself, I could use a little bit more. I could use, another few bites here. I'm not quite there. That's the time to stop. And if you do that, you'll give your brain a chance to catch up. Your hormones will kick in, like GLP-1, which is, secreted by your body naturally. All that stuff will catch up to you and you'll be fine. So, you're going to have 20 or 30 minutes there where you're thinking to yourself, I'm not quite full. That's great. That's exactly what you should be feeling. 30 minutes from now, you're going to feel good. And you're going to feel much better than if you'd continued to eat. Because if you continue to eat, not only will you get too many calories, and your blood sugar will go up and your body won't be able to handle and process all that food naturally, but your stomach will be too full, which leads to indigestion, which leads to things like, reflux and excess production of acid. So stop at 80%. You're going to be much, much happier if you do that. And then his last piece of advice is eat mostly plants. He's not saying don't eat meat. You can eat meat, but eat mostly plants and start with the plants. So when you sit down to your plate, eat the stuff on there that's not meat first. And again, give your stomach time to catch up, give yourself time to be full instead of putting a whole bunch of meat into your stomach first. And the reason isn't because, meat is necessarily bad for you. Everybody needs a certain amount of protein. Some people don't do very well on a vegetarian diet. Others will thrive on it. But when you do that, you're going to get fiber and you're going to get some water in there, and it'll help to fill your stomach and help you to naturally control your appetite. Whereas meat is so dense that it goes into your stomach and you just don't have room for all that other stuff necessarily. Excuse me. You have room for it, but what you don't have is you don't have the feedback that you need in order to feel like your stomach is full. You're loading it up with all these really hard to digest proteins from meat and such before you get to that point of satiety. So if you eat some fiber and water containing foods first, then you'll naturally be able to regulate your appetite better than if you start with a whole bunch of meat or something that's, really nutrient dense like that.
Wow. Scott, something, I get a lot of conversations and questions from drivers today, which I find very interesting. Gluten. They're asking more and more about gluten.
Yeah.
Free. And so I'm very familiar with it because my wife, she's full blown celiac. I mean, she's like, we can't, and I don't have a problem, but I stopped only to make it easy, for her, because she makes everything. She makes her own bread and all of our, own peanut butter, everything, right? She does it from scratch. And so, when we go out, it's, of course, you always have to be mindful, right, of where you're at, where you ask for it. And sometimes people don't really understand, but, people who have celiac, I can tell within seconds if she, is going over, is bitten into something that has gluten on it.
Yeah.
Her lips swell up automatically. Right. And so I wanted to get your thoughts about this, because drivers are starting to ask me more and more about this all the time. And they think that they have gluten issues.
So, full-blown celiac disease is relatively rare. There aren't a lot of people who do have it. I'm sorry to hear your wife has that. That's hard.
Right.
It's one of those things that people who have it, like you say, they know. There's no question. They don't have to ask, hey, should I avoid gluten or not? It's obvious and it's immediate and it's severe. So if you have celiac disease, you're going to know, and you're going to be able to figure that out and avoid it completely. Most people don't have a problem with gluten. The majority of the population doesn't. But there is this kind of in-between area where people can be sensitive to gluten, right? If you get too much of it, they can have difficulty processing it. And that gluten kind of sensitivity part of it, there's not really a good way to diagnose it. There's not really a good way to say, yes, you have it or no, you don't. The only way that you can do it is through paying attention and through, your own personal experience. One of the things, if you're concerned about it, that you think, you might have it, that you could do is to use a food diary. So a food diary is just simply where you write down everything you eat, and then you go back, an hour later or whatever it is, and you kind of rate how you feel. So the symptoms that you might have or the issues you might have, you write those down. And then over time, you look and see if there are patterns there. And if the pattern suggests that whenever you eat a food that's high in gluten, you end up with, certain symptoms or whatever, then you might want to avoid that. But I don't think there's, what the study shows, there's not widespread gluten insensitivity. It's still a relatively small portion of the population that has it, but no one can really tell you how to do that or whether or not you have gluten sensitivity. It's one of those things you just got to figure out yourself. And a food diary can really help. That can be one of the ways that you can know whether you should use it or not.
So personally, I've been tested and don't have it, but I got to tell you that whether it's in my brain or what, but I feel better when I don't, and I eat homemade bread opposed to eating, bread off the shelf, which is just, like you said, just horrific. It's just, all kinds of crazy ingredients. And I remember a lot of times when I stop and I just do it because it's what I do. I could go in some of the travel centers or even convenience stores, and I look at these, and they say, well, Bob, what do you think? Here's a good choice. Here's egg salad sandwich. Well, I said, okay, let's pick it up and read it. You read on there, and I was like, my grandmother never made egg salad sandwich with all this.
Yeah, right.
Why? I mean, all that. I mean, it was eggs. So,
yeah, right.
And this time I wanted to ask you too, if you agree about this. I tell people all the time, whether it's drivers or anyone I'm talking to, everybody has access to the most reliable and cost-effective lab is their own self, right? And what works for Scott may not work for Bob, but works vice versa, right? And I tell them that they got to find out what works good for them, right? It's almost like what you were saying there a little bit ago about keeping the diary and find out what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, that's great advice. And you're absolutely right. Learning to listen to your body is a critical skill that I think everybody needs to develop. Right. And the only way you can do that, though, is if you kind of pay attention. Something like a food diary, it just helps you pay attention. It just helps to focus your attention, helps you to, take kind of the noise out of that process a little bit. We have, as human beings, we have a tendency to see correlations everywhere. I ate this, I got sick, that food must be a bad food, or I got food poisoning from that food or whatever. It may not even be that. You may have gotten the flu, or it may be a completely different thing. Maybe that, you ate something else. So it's hard to figure out what correlations are real and what correlations aren't real unless you do something that's a little more disciplined, like trying a food diary or experimenting. Just stop eating gluten for a while and see what happens and see what you think. I will say one thing, though, about the gluten thing. I think a lot of times people associate, certain symptoms with gluten because a lot of foods that contain gluten, meaning a lot of foods that contain wheat, also are foods that contain a lot of sugar, hydrogenated oils, there are a lot of other ingredients that come along for the ride if you're eating prepared foods that have gluten in them. The bread that you talked about is a good example. Homemade bread's going to have those 4 ingredients I told you about, right? Water, salt, yeast, and flour. And yet, if you go and you buy another loaf of bread, it might look the same. It might have the same name, but it's going to have dough conditioners and propionic acid and high fructose corn syrup, and it might have some gums and other things in it. There's all kinds of stuff that's in there, and so people tend to think it's the gluten, but it may be some of those other things too. So,
Right.
Gluten, I think, if you want to avoid it and you feel better without it, great. More power to you. But I'm just suggesting that it might be that there's other things that come along for the ride in foods that contain gluten and wheat that could actually be giving you some trouble.
Absolutely. So something else too, I wanted to discuss with you. So one of the things when I first talk with drivers, I highly recommend to them, and it takes a little more time, but really it's beneficial for them nutrition wise, but also economically, is try before they have to, if they're have over the road, right, and they got to be out for long periods of time, that go that weekend before and shop and prepare, right? And most all the trucks today are so sophisticated. It's one of the things I worked with Freightliner on creating more of a lifestyle environment for them in the cabs, or bigger refrigerators where they could store foods and have better resources, because in the day, life and time of a driver during the day, they're going to get stuck. Construction, snow, whatever it is, right? And as I say, when you don't have a good choice to reach for, you make a bad one. Yeah. Right?
That is so smart, Bob, to have access to something when things go wrong. Because I do think that the majority of the bad choices that most people make, they make for convenience. It's not because that's what they prefer, what they want. It's because they just, for whatever reason, they either don't have access, they don't have time, and a little bit of forethought and preparation can make a big difference.
It's one of the reasons why, right, when you're at the grocery store, why they call it those impulses, right there. They got all that candy staring at you, and you're standing there in line waiting to get out of there, and you're hungry, and they start grabbing it. And so one of the questions I get asked the most when I'm doing radio interviews on Road Dog Trucking Radio is they call up and they say, Bob, when are you going to get these travel centers to stop serving all this crap? And I said, well, my friend, here's the first step is if you got to stop buying all that crap. You keep buying it, they're going to sell it.
That's right. So
the next time you're in there and they have 3 Kit Kats for $1, say, I'd rather have 3 bananas, or whatever. And you got to do your part. And I'm seeing more positive changes, right? It's happening. But it's like, the other thing too is it's just not the driving population, drivers. It's most of America, right?
Sure.
That they it's about making better choices. It's just the drivers don't have access.
It's harder for them because they're not home. They're not controlling their environment, like you said. There's most of the options that they have and the opportunities they had. Those things are provided by somebody else, whether it's a travel center or a convenience store or whatever. And so unless they take control of that and are proactive in making sure that they have other options, it's really, really difficult to sort through that and to find good options. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, my friend, listen, this has just been wonderful, and I can't thank you enough for sharing all your knowledge. And I know you're a very busy guy, and I'm sure you're off to another event somewhere, but thank you so much for sharing this information. And I know the drivers are going to look forward to it, and I'd love to have you come back on again sometime. And before we go there, real quick, please tell people about your new position, CEO of Wellvine. Tell real quick about that, because I think that's some great information. And also, everybody's got a sweet tooth, right? So tell them about that, please.
Yeah, sure. So Wellvine is not just the name of the venture, but it's the name of an ingredient that we make. And what we do is we take wine grapes that have been pressed. So you take a grape and you press the juice out to make wine. In this case, we're actually using white grapes. We're using Chardonnay grapes, which was kind of a surprise to everyone when we started doing that, because everyone assumed that red grapes are going to be a lot better for you than wine grapes. But we did lots of testing and lots of studies. And what we found was that if you look at cardiovascular parameters, meaning things like blood sugar, blood glucose, blood pressure, the health of the blood vessels themselves, vascular health, endothelial health, that the white grapes outperformed the red grapes. And so we started looking into why that was the case. And as it turns out, there are a lot of things in white grapes that are very similar to what you find in green tea or in cocoa. They're these family of flavanols, they're called catechins and flavanols, that have profound effects on cardiovascular health. And even more interesting, I didn't know this until I actually started working with material, but when you make red wine, you actually ferment the grapes. Mm-hmm. And then you press the partially fermented juice out of the grapes. So there's this fermentation that occurs before the grapes are even pressed. But white grapes, you actually press them right away before you ferment it, and you ferment only the juice. And what that means is that if you pick a white grape and you press it, the material that's left over after you pressed it is, 12 to 18 hours old. That's it. It's basically fresh fruit. The difference is that most of the sugar has been pressed out with the juice so that you can ferment it into alcohol. So what you have is you have all the goodness of grapes, all the wholesomeness of these really interesting grapes, but you have 70 to 80% less sugar because the sugar's been pressed out. So that material is what we take. We take those kind of desugared, dejuiced grapes, and we have a proprietary process to preserve all of the flavanols and the original nutrients in the grape. And then we turn it into a powder. And that powder, we've used it as an ingredient in all kinds of things. It goes into baked goods. We actually have a chocolate brand called Bind a Bar that includes the grape powder in there as part of the chocolate recipe, part of the chocolate itself. And we're starting to, sell it to other companies. And what we found is that it has a really positive effect on the microbiome. So it helps to feed your gut bacteria because it's about 50% fiber. And then it has, lots of these flavanols and antioxidants, and it has vitamins and minerals like magnesium in it, all in kind of that natural matrix as a whole food. So that's what we're selling now, and it's pretty exciting.
So how can people, if they want to, order your product, how can they do that?
Well, it's available on Amazon. You can go to Amazon.com and grab it there. We sell it on our website too. For a lot of people, it's easier through Amazon because, you get shipping and do all that other stuff. But we do sell it online. We're not selling it yet in grocery stores. We're just kind of starting out. So eventually we hope to have it, in retail locations. But right now online is about the only way you can get it. And
do you still have a newsletter?
I don't. Okay. No. Now, I've worked with a lot of doctors over the years who have newsletters, like Dr. Julian Whitaker and Dr. David Williams and, others. But I don't currently have a newsletter. Yeah.
Okay, my friend. Well, thanks again. And this has been just wonderful. I really appreciate it. And wow, you're still my hero.
It's a pleasure to be on here. I love what you're doing. I love the common sense approach that you have to all of these things. I love the fact that you're working with, drivers and people who really need some help and attention. And it's refreshing to see somebody put their best interests first and really come to them with solutions that are achievable and workable. So congratulations. It's a great thing you're doing.
And what I love most about it, Scott, is for people like you and I mean, when I refer to people like in the residential sector, right, in the gyms and so forth, if they don't look like everybody in the magazine in 30 days, they quit.
Yeah.
But for what you and I talk about all the time is I'm more concerned about it on the inside, right? And that's what's great about this population is because that's what they have to be worried about to get their license, right? To get their blood pressure down. And then I tell them, all of a sudden in 6 months, you look in the mirror and you go, oh my gosh, I look different. Or I've lost 20, 30 pounds, whatever it is, right? It's getting that internal engine running smooth first, and then all the other things can come.
Yeah. And those are fringe benefits, right? Those things happen naturally. But I just love the idea of, real solutions for real people instead of these highly rarefied kind of, influencer driven things that speak only to people that probably already are there and don't need a lot of help anyway.
Exactly. All right, buddy. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bob.
We'll talk soon. I'll get you a copy of this.
Sounds good. Take care.